The chill air of the Baltic was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of salt and distance. It was a kind of cold that seemed to seep into the very walls of the massive, gray Soviet embassy building. Inside, on the second floor, Major Oleg Gordievsky, a man whose tailored suit and placid expression concealed a brilliant, restless mind, was staring out at the frozen harbor. To the outside world, he was a rising star in the KGB's first chief directorate, Foreign Intelligence, specifically Section X, which dealt with Scandinavian affairs. His posting to Copenhagen was a plum assignment, a quiet backwater perfectly suited for the methodical collection of minor political and technological intelligence. But beneath this bureaucratic facade, Gordievsky was wrestling with a far more dangerous kind of collection. He wasn't merely a dedicated Soviet officer. He was a man undergoing a profound and private political metamorphosis. This change had not come in a flash of blinding light, but in the slow, grinding disillusionment of years. His father had been a dedicated KGB officer, instilling in Oleg a youthful, fervent patriotism. He had been trained in the elite MGB Institute, learned flawless English and Danish, and was steeped in a communist dogma. Yet his early field experiences in the early 1960s had chipped away at the idealized image of the Soviet system. The brutal reality of the Berlin Wall's construction, the paranoia gripping the state apparatus, and the pervasive surveillance that suffocated every aspect of Soviet life had left him cold. His initial posting to the Soviet residency in Copenhagen in 1966 was meant to be a stepping stone. It became a catalyst. It was during this initial tour that the full, unvarnished ugliness of the KGB's operations became impossible to ignore. He saw his colleagues fabricating intelligence to please Moscow, inventing conspiracies where none existed simply to justify their existence and budget. He saw the cynical manipulation of foreign communists and the heavy-handed, often brutal treatment of anyone deemed a dissident. The final, crushing blow to his belief came with the Prague Spring of 1968, when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, extinguishing a flickering hope for socialism with a human face. For Gordievsky, this was the definitive betrayal, an act of aggression against a fellow socialist state that cemented his view. The Soviet Union was not a glorious revolutionary power, but a stagnant, fear-driven empire. The decision to betray his country was not taken lightly. It was a desperate act of conscience. He knew the risk. The KGB's reach was long, and the punishment for treason was a bullet to the back of the head in the Lubyanka's basement. His internal turmoil, however, became an external reality on a damp evening in 1974. Gordievsky, using the alias Sunbeam and operating under the pretext of an official meeting, initiated contact with British intelligence. He did not seek money. He sought an audience. He wanted to help dismantle the very structure he was a part of. The meeting was a masterpiece of clandestine tradecraft. A low-profile rendezvous in a Copenhagen park near the Castella fortress. The initial contact was an unassuming British diplomat who introduced himself casually. Gordievsky, ever the professional spy, maintained a poker face. His hands, though, tucked deep inside the pockets of his heavy wool coat, were sweating. He carried no documents. Everything he knew was memorized. His opening gambit was simple, chillingly effective. He provided intelligence on a key KGB penetration in the West. He was offering a lifeline, a trove of secrets that no British officer could possibly ignore. The MI6, Secret Intelligence Service, stationed in Copenhagen, initially skeptical, quickly realized they had captured a whale. They named him Farewell, a nod to the finality of his defection in spirit, if not in body. He was, to their astonishment, offering to be a sleeper agent inside the enemy's highest ranks, feeding them secrets from the very heart of the KGB. This was unprecedented. He was a controlled asset, a spy working in place, and the intelligence he could provide would be invaluable. A constant, unfiltered stream of Soviet foreign policy aims, military intentions, and, most crucially, a comprehensive list of KGB officers and agents operating in the West. Gordievsky's first transmission was focused and precise. He detailed the structure of the Copenhagen residency, identified every officer by name and rank, and outlined their specific targets. He provided details on the KGB's communications protocols, their dead drop, locations, and their observation tactics. He was tearing the veil away from their operations, piece by painstaking piece. The British knew they had to treat him with extreme caution. Any mistake, any leak, would not only mean Gordievsky's death, but would also compromise their entire European network. His handlers, initially tentative, grew to trust his discipline and the sheer volume of accurate, high-grade intelligence he was providing. His motives were not venal, they were ideological. And in the world of espionage, an ideological commitment is the strongest bond. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1978, his first posting back to Moscow after years abroad. This was the moment of maximum danger. Copenhagen had been a relatively safe environment. Moscow was the lion's den, the headquarters of the organization he was betraying. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given a post in the center, the KGB's labyrinthine headquarters in the Yasenevo district. This was exactly where MI6 wanted him. He was now operating within the First Chief Directorate, FCD, the global spying arm of the KGB. From his new desk, Gordievsky had access to the strategic thinking of the Soviet leadership. He was perfectly positioned to be one of the most important double agents of the Cold War. The stakes, already high, were now immeasurable. He maintained contact with MI6 through a complex, layered system of covert signals and coded messages, preparing for the day the music would inevitably stop. 1981. The center, Yasenevo District, Moscow. The headquarters of the KGB's First Chief Directorate was a sprawling complex, an architectural monument to Soviet paranoia. Inside its warrens, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Gordievsky moved with the practiced ease of a trusted official. His current assignment was critical. The First Department, North America, granting him direct visibility into the highest priority of Soviet intelligence, the United States. This was where the gold lay, and Gordievsky was panning furiously. The early 1980s were arguably the most dangerous period of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The rhetoric from both sides, particularly following the election of Ronald Reagan, was incendiary. Moscow was genuinely terrified of a surprise nuclear attack, a preemptive strike by the West. This fear manifested in a top-secret, massive global intelligence program codenamed Operation Ryan, Raketno-Yadernoi Napadny, nuclear missile attack. Ryan was an all-encompassing effort to search, in real time, for the subtle, often ambiguous indicators that the West was preparing to launch. Every KGB residency and GRU station worldwide was mobilized, their officers tasked with watching for lights going on late in the Pentagon, changes in diplomatic travel schedules, even fluctuations in blood bank reserves, anything that might signal the countdown to Armageddon. Gordievsky, by virtue of his position, had immediate and privileged access to the sheer, existential panic that Operation Ryan was causing in the Kremlin. He recognized the profound danger in this misplaced fear. If the KGB misinterpreted an exercise, a political maneuver, or even a routine maintenance schedule as an Ryan indicator, it could trigger a catastrophic, self-fulfilling prophecy. He realized his intelligence was not just tactical. It was strategic, capable of potentially averting global conflict. Using his carefully established communication system, involving book codes, where he would signal his desire to meet by subtle acts like placing a chalk mark on a specific bridge parapet or holding a shopping bag in a certain way near a bus stop, Gordievsky began to feed the entirety of the Ryan program to his MI6 handlers. The intelligence he provided was so detailed, so alarming, that it caused a seismic shift in Western capitals. He explained that the Soviets weren't posturing. They genuinely believed that the U.S. was preparing for a decapitating first strike. Gordievsky revealed the full scope of the Ryan reporting requirements and the hysterical pressure Moscow was placing on field officers. The British and Americans suddenly understood that their routine military exercises, like Able Archer 83, a massive NATO command post exercise simulating a nuclear escalation, were not being seen as drills, but as genuine, terrifying precursors to a launch. Gordievsky's revelations, delivered through coded bursts and furtive meetings in places like the Moscow woods during his carefully planned, brief visits outside the center, allowed MI6 and the CIA to provide unprecedented context to the Soviet mindset. They were able to adjust the visibility and tenor of their own operations to subtly de-escalate the tension, realizing that they were dealing with fear, not just aggression. Beyond Ryan, Gordievsky was a walking encyclopedia of KGB personnel. He unmasked dozens of illegals, deep-cover spies operating without diplomatic immunity, and co-optees, Western citizens secretly recruited by the KGB. One of his most important targets was the KGB's London residency. He meticulously identified almost every single officer and agent operating in the UK, essentially dismantling the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus in Britain. This level of penetration was unheard of. MI6 officers, particularly his primary handler, Michael Smith, began to regard him not just as an agent, but as a priceless, indispensable national asset. His commitment to the mission was absolute, but the strain of living the double life in the heart of the enemy was beginning to show. In Moscow, the paranoia was palpable. He spent his days sitting in meetings, reading reports signed by men he knew were liars and bullies, and then spent his nights memorizing the very secrets he would be betraying. The opulence of his official life, the promotions, the prestige, the official cars, was a suffocating cage. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, acutely aware that any minor error, a misplaced word, a nervous twitch, could result in his arrest and execution. His professionalism saved him, but the risk was magnified when he was promoted again and posted to London in 1982. This was the crowning achievement of his career. He became the KGB resident designate, the chief of all KGB operations in the United Kingdom. This was a gift to MI6, a Soviet master spy who was, in reality, their greatest asset. However, the world of espionage is a hall of mirrors, and the KGB was not immune to its own betrayals. Unbeknownst to Gordievsky, in the mid-1970s, a disillusioned CIA officer named Aldrich Ames began to pass information to the KGB. Ames's treachery remained latent for years, but by 1985, the sheer volume of high-grade, accurate intelligence the West was receiving began to alarm Moscow. They started looking for a mole. The crucial information that compromised Gordievsky did not come from a breakdown in his own tradecraft, but from a fatal error elsewhere. An anonymous walk-in at the U.S. Embassy in Rome, a former KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko, defected in late 1985. Yurchenko provided a brief but devastating piece of information. A top-level KGB officer, codenamed Farewell, was betraying them. Crucially, Yurchenko did not know the name of the traitor, but he knew the context. The CIA, in their eagerness, shared Yurchenko's unverified information with the British. MI6, recognizing the terrifying implications, knew instantly that this referred to Gordievsky. The music had stopped. The safety of the most important spy of the decade was now measured in hours. May 1985. The KGB residency, London, UK. The world was a comfortable delusion for Oleg Gordievsky in the spring of 1985. As the KGB resident designate in London, he was at the zenith of his official career. He lived in a respectable, state-allocated flat, attended diplomatic receptions, and presided over the network he was simultaneously dismantling. His relationship with MI6 was intimate and productive, a partnership forged in the shadows of the Cold War. He was passing intelligence about Soviet operations in the United States and the UK with unparalleled speed and accuracy. But the foundation of this success was about to crumble. The defection and subsequent debriefing of Vitaly Yurchenko by the CIA had set in motion a deadly chain of events. While Yurchenko provided only fragments, an officer in the London residency was a traitor, codenamed Farewell, The mosaic of evidence pointing to Gordievsky was too compelling for the KGB to ignore. He was the only officer fitting the profile and providing the context of the revealed information. Moscow had begun its internal investigation, a slow-motion, bureaucratic process that, once concluded, would result in certain death. Gordievsky received the summons in late May 1985. It was a deceptively routine cable from the center in Moscow, requesting his immediate return for consultations regarding a new assignment, a major promotion, they claimed, to head of a key department in the FCD. This kind of sudden, high-level summons, while superficially flattering, sent a jolt of icy fear through him. It was too soon, too urgent, and too vague. He knew the KGB's operational tempo. This felt manufactured. Immediately, he initiated the stop signal, the emergency alarm designated for his MI6 handlers. This signal was a carefully choreographed, nonverbal act, a large, gaudy red sign in the window of his apartment on a specific day, a subtle, repeated gesture in a public place. It meant one thing: I am compromised. Activate the escape plan. His primary handler, Michael Smith, received the signal and understood the gravity. The plan, codenamed Operation Pimlico, had been drafted, revised, and kept dormant for years, a document of last resort, detailing Gordievsky's extraction should his cover ever be blown. It was complex, highly risky, and dependent on perfect timing and execution in the heart of the enemy's territory. Moscow's intention became chillingly clear. They were not bringing him back for a promotion. They were reeling him in for interrogation, isolation, and execution. He was ordered to fly back to Moscow immediately, alone. He could not risk confiding in his wife or two young daughters, for their safety as much as his own. His family, still loyal to the Soviet state and unaware of his true activities, would be held as collateral. Upon arrival at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, the first signs of trouble were subtle but unmistakable. The usual welcoming committee of official drivers and colleagues was absent. Instead, he was met by two unfamiliar, burly men from the KGB's second chief directorate, counterintelligence, men he did not know and whose manner was cold and professional. They informed him, with a forced civility, that he was being taken directly to a dacha, a state-owned country house, for a security briefing before his meetings at the center. The dacha was located in a secluded forest outside Moscow, far from any neighbors or immediate help. It was a classic KGB trap, an isolated, controlled environment where an arrest could be conducted quietly, without witnesses. The men confiscated his diplomatic passport and his briefcase, claiming it was standard procedure. Gordievsky played the role of the loyal, confused officer perfectly, masking the terror that was now a cold knot in his stomach. The following day, the interrogation began. It was not a formal, aggressive session, but a masterfully orchestrated psychological attack. He was brought before Viktor Grushko, the deputy head of the FCD. Grushko did not accuse him directly. Instead, Gordievsky was subjected to a 5-hour-long, slow, suffocating conversation over lunch and copious amounts of brandy. "Oleg, my friend," Grushko began, his voice warm and paternal, "we have learned there is a sickness in our ranks. A terrible infection. We are cleaning it out." The atmosphere was thick with unspoken menace. The goal was to force a confession through psychological pressure, alcohol, and exhaustion. Grushko subtly guided the conversation to his time in Copenhagen and London, probing for inconsistencies, measuring his reactions. He pressed Gordievsky to drink, pouring him glass after glass of Armenian brandy, a notorious KGB tactic to loosen the tongue and diminish mental defenses. Gordievsky, knowing the risk of refusal, drank, but he had been preparing for this moment for years. He had maintained a rigorous training regimen to control his body and mind. He deliberately spilled some, poured some out discreetly, and forced himself to remain lucid, maintaining the pretense of a slightly inebriated but loyal officer. He feigned surprise and indignation at the suggestion of a mole, steering the conversation away from his own actions and towards generalized Western aggression. The interrogation did not stop. For the next several days, he was confined to the dacha. His personal freedom was entirely curtailed. He was under constant but subtle surveillance by the two agents who had met him at the airport. He was effectively a prisoner, awaiting the inevitable formal accusation. He knew they were waiting for the smoking gun evidence, which thankfully, Yurchenko had not provided. He had bought himself a few days, perhaps a week, but the clock was ticking down to zero. He had to activate the full, high-risk escape plan, Operation Pimlico, and he had to do it without alerting his captors, who were watching his every move. His only chance lay in the contingency he and MI6 had meticulously prepared for this very moment. July 16, 1985. The KGB dacha, outside Moscow. The suffocating atmosphere of the secluded dacha had become Gordievsky's cage. He was entering his third week of confinement, subjected to a torturous routine of faux-friendly conversations, long silences, and pervasive surveillance. The two second chief directorate guards, sturdy, silent men named Alexei and Sergei, were his constant, polite jailers. He knew that the moment Moscow gathered enough evidence, the facade would drop and the execution order would follow. Time was his most critical enemy. It was essential to trigger Operation Pimlico without alerting Alexei or Sergei, who tracked his movements even to the latrine. The escape plan was rooted in a prearranged, highly specific signal designed for maximum deniability, the Mars Bar Rendezvous. The signal itself was simple, almost absurdly low-tech, relying on a common street pattern and a mundane object. On the following day, a specific MI6 officer, a designated agent known to Gordievsky as the Trigger, would position himself at a precise street corner near the Kievsky station in Moscow at 7:30 p.m. This officer would be carrying a specific kind of Sainsbury's supermarket bag, known for its distinctive orange and blue logo, and, crucially, he would be eating a Mars chocolate bar. This visual spectacle was the coded confirmation. The plan is active. Prepare to move. Gordievsky needed an excuse to leave the dacha and travel to the city center. He used a meticulously constructed lie, playing on Soviet bureaucracy and domestic routine. He told his guards, with a show of exasperated loyalty, that he urgently needed to go to his old apartment to retrieve a family photo album, a sentimental item his wife would need when she joined him later in Moscow. He framed it as a necessary task for a loyal husband, leveraging the Soviet ideal of family values. Alexei, after a brief, suspicious call to the center, reluctantly granted permission, provided the two guards accompanied him. The journey into Moscow was a blur of nervous control. Gordievsky sat in the back of the official black Volga, the two guards flanking him. As they drove towards the center, his heart pounded against his ribs, a physical drumbeat counting down to disaster or deliverance. He was scanning the streets, looking for the specific corner, the designated agent, and the chocolate wrapper. He directed the car to an area close to the Kievsky station, feigning a sudden need for some air. The guards, perhaps wearying of their babysitting duties, allowed him a short, escorted walk. And then he saw him. The British agent was there, perfectly positioned, casually chewing on the unmistakable foil-wrapped confectionery. The Sainsbury's bag, a tiny, absurd piece of Western consumerism in the Soviet capital, was a stark, unmistakable confirmation. Operation Pimlico was go. The agent, having confirmed Gordievsky saw him, did not make eye contact. He simply finished the Mars bar, crumpled the wrapper, and walked away. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. It was a flawless execution of the go signal. Now, Gordievsky had to transmit his location and the time of his plan moved back to the agent without the guards noticing. The prearranged method was the Kuznetsov drop, named after a familiar Moscow monument. It required him to walk past a particular large gray building and make a seemingly casual, innocuous gesture. He had to drop an item at a specific location, a dead drop that would be retrieved by a second MI6 team. As they approached the planned spot, Gordievsky pretended to tie his shoelace. Bending down, he used the moment to discreetly slip a small piece of chalk, borrowed from his daughter's forgotten toy set, from his pocket and place it on a low window ledge. This small chalk mark, invisible to the average passerby, was the final message: I will make my move. The MI6 team, which had been in Moscow for several weeks under deep cover as diplomats, immediately understood the message. The chalk mark confirmed two things. Gordievsky was alive and compromised, and he was prepared to initiate the final, desperate stage of the extraction. Back at the dacha, the tension mounted. Gordievsky knew he needed to make his physical break in the next 48 hours, as his handlers would need that time to finalize the ground transportation to the border. He had to vanish, leaving no trace. He had planned to use his daily exercise routine as the moment of escape. Every afternoon, he was allowed a 45-minute, closely supervised walk in the small, wooded area behind the dacha. On Wednesday, July 17, 1985, Gordievsky began his walk. He wore layers of heavy clothing despite the summer warmth, a necessity because the escape route would take him through the vast, cold emptiness of the northern Soviet landscape. As he walked, seemingly taking deep breaths of the pine-scented air, he began to execute his final, irreversible step. He had to break line of sight with his guards, Alexei and Sergei, who were pacing 20 yards behind him, smoking cigarettes and chatting softly. He spotted a thick cluster of fir trees, a blind spot. He waited for the exact moment when their attention flagged, when Sergei lit a new cigarette. In a flash, Gordievsky darted off the path, plunging into the thicket of trees. He ran not toward the road, but away from the dacha, into the deeper woods, relying on his training to move silently. He knew he had about 3 minutes before the guards, realizing he was gone, would raise the alarm. Every second counted. He ran until his lungs burned, discarding his outer jacket to blend with the summer camouflage of the woods. He had vanished into the immense, indifferent Soviet landscape, a ghost in the machine he had spent years dismantling. He had broken free of the dacha, but the true test, the 100-mile dash through Moscow's suburbs and the long journey north, was only just beginning. July 17, 1985. The forests outside Moscow. Gordievsky plunged deeper into the forest, his heart rate mirroring the frantic ticking of the clock in his mind. He wasn't running aimlessly. He was following the predetermined, long-neglected escape route memorized years prior. An old, overgrown logging trail that would lead him southeast, away from the dacha and towards a secluded rail line. He knew the guards, Alexei and Sergei, would assume he'd fled toward the main road to hail a taxi or bus. His counterintuitive move bought him precious minutes. He ran for nearly 20 minutes, the rough terrain and dense undergrowth tearing at his clothes. When he finally reached the Pavlitsky railway line, his lungs were heaving, and he was covered in scratches. He located the pre-designated marker, a twisted piece of rebar near a derelict signal box, and knew he was on track. His goal now was to reach the Volokholamsk Highway, a major artery leading northwest, where the first phase of the MI6 extraction would commence. Meanwhile, back at the dacha, the alarm had been raised. Alexei and Sergei, realizing their charge was gone, had initially panicked. Their immediate, instinctive fear was not for the state, but for their own necks. They knew that losing a high-ranking officer under their supervision, particularly one suspected of treason, meant certain ruin, or worse. The first report went back to the center. Gordievsky has disappeared during his walk. The center's reaction was swift and terrifying. Viktor Grushko, the deputy head of the FCD who had interrogated Gordievsky, ordered an immediate, silent dragnet. The KGB could not afford the public spectacle of a senior officer defecting from the heart of Moscow. The operation was classified, highest priority, internal security. They did not alert the militia, uniformed police, immediately, fearing a leak or incompetence. This crucial delay, rooted in the KGB's institutional arrogance and secrecy, gave Gordievsky a slender window of opportunity. KGB pursuit teams, composed of agents from the 2nd and 8th Directorates, Counterintelligence and Communication Security, flooded the area around the dacha. They set up internal checkpoints on known choke points and bridges leading out of the region. The search focused heavily on the south and east, the direction of the major airports and foreign embassies, exactly where Gordievsky was not heading. Gordievsky spent the next 3 hours navigating the suburban maze, avoiding populated areas, moving through fields and back alleys, and staying off the main roads. He finally emerged near a small, dilapidated bus stop on a secondary road feeding onto the Volokholamsk highway. He looked like any other middle-aged Soviet man, slightly disheveled, carrying a cheap plastic bag containing his few remaining essentials. He successfully boarded a suburban bus heading northwest, paying his fare with trembling hands. The bus ride was an exercise in controlled terror. Every face was a potential KGB agent, every shadow a vehicle turning to intercept him. He sat in the rear, staring out the window, watching the familiar landscape of Moscow suburbs give way to the forests and lakes of the Oblast region. He was acutely aware of the risk. Soviet counterintelligence had satellite capabilities and access to every piece of domestic surveillance. If they decided to check bus manifests or simply stop and check IDs, his entire plan was over. He successfully traversed the suburban net and disembarked at a planned drop-off point, a rural crossroad an hour north of the city. He then had to walk the final critical mile to the actual rendezvous point. This location, deep in the woods near a small village called Kalinino, was the culmination of years of MI6 planning. It was the designated pickup point for Operation Pimlico. The extraction team, for MI6 officers operating undercover as staff from the British Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, had been meticulously preparing their vehicle for weeks. It was an embassy-registered, light-tan, two-door Saab 900, a car chosen because its shape was common enough not to draw attention, yet distinct enough for Gordievsky to recognize. They had driven the car into the USSR across the Finnish border several days earlier, a risky move that placed them in direct danger should the plan fail. The car was specially modified for this mission. Hidden in the boot, beneath the spare tire and a thick layer of insulation, were 2 large, specially constructed, sealed tins designed to be undetectable by Soviet sniffer dogs. These were not for drugs or documents. They were designed to contain a human being. The theory was brutal in its simplicity. Hide the spy in a sealed compartment that would pass a casual physical inspection and mask his scent from canine searches at the border. As Gordievsky walked into the prearranged clearing, a desolate, wind-swept stretch of dirt road, he saw the Saab parked and idling. His designated handler, an MI6 officer known only as Peter, stood by the open driver's side door, ostensibly checking a map. The sight of the car, a symbol of freedom, almost caused him to collapse. He walked directly to the vehicle, maintaining a rigid pace and expression. Peter did not speak. He simply nodded once, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed. In the world of high-stakes espionage, silence was safety. Peter opened the boot, revealing the modified compartment. Gordievsky, without hesitation, climbed in. The 2 tins had been removed, leaving the hollow space. He was told to cover himself with blankets and an old sleeping bag. The tins were then replaced over him. The MI6 team's sole objective now was speed and an unnerving normalcy. The 4 British officers, Peter, plus 2 others, Paul and John, and a young woman named Penny, got into the car. They were now carrying the most sensitive human cargo of the Cold War. Their goal, to drive the 200 miles, 320 kilometers, northwest to the border crossing at Valama, Finland, before the KGB dragnet could tighten its grip. The silent alarm was now fully activated, and the world's most feared intelligence agency was hunting for the man beneath the floorboards of a tan Saab. July 18, 1985. The Leningrad Highway, M10, Soviet Union. The tan Saab 900, carrying the 4 MI6 officers and their priceless, hidden cargo, moved north onto the Leningrad Highway, now the M10. The car's pace was agonizingly measured, fast enough to cover ground, but slow enough to avoid drawing the attention of the militia highway patrols. Their cover story was simple and well-rehearsed. A British embassy team from Helsinki was returning from a short, culturally minded trip to Moscow, laden with Soviet souvenirs and duty-free alcohol. Beneath the floorboards, Crammed into a space barely larger than a coffin, Oleg Gordievsky lay rigid. The two metal tins, which had been reinstalled over him, provided a terrifying proximity to the heat of the engine and the deafening noise of the road. His position was excruciating, his body locked in a fetal curl. But the physical pain was secondary to the mental strain. Every rumble, every shift in the car's movement sounded like a KGB car pulling alongside. The MI6 team operated with flawless discipline. Peter, the driver, maintained a casual, slightly bored expression, his right foot controlling their fate. The atmosphere inside the car was silent, broken only by the crackle of the Russian radio station playing upbeat Soviet pop music, a deliberate choice to project normalcy. Penny, the young female officer, sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally pointing out landmarks with feigned tourist enthusiasm. An open map of the USSR spread on her lap. Paul and John, in the back seat, occasionally commented on the scenery, maintaining a light, innocuous stream of chatter. This meticulous facade was their shield. Approximately 2 hours into the journey, the first major hurdle presented itself, an impromptu Soviet military checkpoint near the town of Tver. This was not part of the standard border controls. It was an early sign that the KGB's silent dragnet was expanding. The Saab was waved to the side by a young, heavily armed soldier. Peter calmly stopped the car, pulling out his diplomatic passport and the official vehicle papers. The soldier, a junior lieutenant, approached the driver's side, shining a harsh, military-grade flashlight into the cabin. He looked at the four Westerners, too clean, too well-dressed, too composed. He then peered into the rear, his eyes lingering on the heavy blankets and scattered tourist trinkets. "Your papers, please," the lieutenant requested in heavily accented English, his voice nervous. Peter handed over the documents, maintaining a smile that was warm but distant. "British Embassy, Helsinki. Returning home, Lieutenant. Had a lovely time in Moscow, but duty calls." The officers spent a long, agonizing moment scrutinizing the diplomatic documents, comparing the photos to the faces. Meanwhile, Penny started a low, rambling complaint about the quality of the Soviet roads and the long drive ahead. This tactic, nuisance distraction, was designed to overwhelm and bore the officer into haste. The officer, clearly uncomfortable with diplomatic personnel and eager to pass this foreign problem up the chain, eventually waved them through. But the close call sent a shockwave through the MI6 team. They knew the KGB was closing the net faster than anticipated. They couldn't afford a single, small procedural mistake. The most terrifying moment of the journey was yet to come, and it centered on Gordievsky's carefully disguised scent. The KGB, knowing the limitations of human search teams, would inevitably deploy sniffing dogs, German shepherds and Lycus, highly trained to detect the fear scent and human residue of a fugitive. To combat this, the MI6 team employed a bizarre but effective countermeasure, a massive amount of pungent, highly aromatic food. Before the trip, the officers had purchased several kilograms of strong-smelling Norwegian fish and stinky French cheeses, along with copious amounts of heavily scented perfume. As they neared the designated KGB dog checkpoint, an inevitable feature of border security operations, the officers executed this scent protocol. Peter poured a liberal amount of perfume onto the floor carpets, masking the interior with an overwhelming floral bouquet. John and Paul, using knives and forks, began to spread the foul-smelling fish and cheese onto the rear floorboards, deliberately allowing the odor to permeate the cabin. They then opened a large packet of heavily scented potato chips. The car interior quickly became a powerful, nauseating cloud of processed food, perfume, and stale fish. Beneath the floor, Gordievsky, sweat plastering him to the metal, could smell the appalling mix. It was almost unbearable, but he knew the purpose: to destroy his scent profile. The Saab reached the final, major KGB internal checkpoint before the border zone. As expected, 2 uniformed border guards were present, accompanied by a handler and a massive, black German shepherd straining at its leash. The dog was trained to detect human presence, fear, and contraband. The handler, a hardened officer with cold eyes, approached the Saab, his dog sniffing tentatively at the tires. "We need to conduct a standard inspection," the handler stated flatly. "Please open your doors and step outside." The four MI6 officers complied, maintaining their practiced air of patient annoyance. As the car doors opened, the nauseating cloud of perfume, fish, and cheese erupted. The handler flinched, wrinkling his nose in unconcealed disgust. The dog, however, reacted immediately. It surged forward, not to the boot where Gordievsky lay, but frantically to the rear floorboards, where the scent of fish and chips was strongest. The dog began to furiously lick the carpets, convinced it had found a particularly appealing snack. The handler, frustrated and disgusted by the animal's unprofessional behavior, yanked the leash. "Get out of there, you idiot! These foreigners carry only rubbish." He didn't bother opening the boot. He simply ordered the dog to sniff the exterior of the car, which it did with the same distracted, food-driven enthusiasm. Within minutes, the handler, tired of the overwhelming stench and the dog's distraction, waved the Saab through. The KGB's top asset, hidden barely 3 inches beneath the dog's nose, was safe for the moment. The final hurdle, the Soviet-Finnish border, lay just ahead. July 19, 1985. The border crossing Valama, USSR. The final stretch of Soviet road before the Finnish border felt like driving through a tunnel of impending doom. The Valama checkpoint was notorious for its thoroughness. It was the last line of defense against both illegal contraband and, crucially, defectors. The border guards here were the elite of the KGB border troops, trained to spot the smallest irregularity. This was the moment of maximum risk, where Gordievsky's life and the success of Operation Pimlico hung by a thread. Inside the Saab, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The scent of fish and perfume, which had saved them from the sniffer dogs, now made the air thick and almost unbearable. Beneath the floorboards, Oleg Gordievsky was fighting a desperate battle against hypoxia and muscle cramps. He had been lying in the sealed compartment for nearly 8 hours, unable to move, his breathing shallow and quick. He was on the verge of passing out, but the adrenaline of knowing he was feet away from freedom kept him conscious. The Saab reached the head of the short queue. The crossing procedure was rigidly standardized: a document check, an inspection of the vehicle's exterior, and finally, a mandatory physical search of the passenger cabin and trunk area. The Soviet border guard, a tall, unsmiling captain, approached the car. He conducted the document check first, scrutinizing the MI6 officers' diplomatic passports and the car's Helsinki plates. Peter and Penny maintained a polite, slightly impatient demeanor, speaking in clipped, neutral English. Then came the physical inspection. The captain ordered the trunk opened. This was the critical moment. The boot contained the 2 reinstalled metal tins, which concealed the compartment. These tins, packed with supposed diplomatic supplies, were the entire basis of the deception. They were sealed and labeled in a way that mimicked official embassy containers, yet the captain had the right to demand they be opened. The captain peered into the trunk, noting the bulky tins. "What is in these containers?" he asked sharply in Russian. Peter, anticipating the question, replied in near-perfect Russian. "Consular supplies, Captain. They are sealed under diplomatic privilege. You know the regulations." He projected an air of slight indignation, using the confidence of diplomatic immunity as a weapon. The captain hesitated. Challenging a sealed diplomatic container was a serious political step, one that required authorization from Moscow and potentially a political incident. He had to weigh his suspicion against his bureaucratic fear of causing trouble. While this diplomatic standoff was taking place, Paul and John initiated the slightly mad tourist routine. They began ostentatiously photographing the border post and the captain himself using a cheap Soviet-made Zenit camera. "Look, Paul, what a magnificent uniform. Do you think we can get one like that in London?" John exclaimed loudly. "Fascinating structure, isn't it? Very brutalist. We must get a shot of the barrier." Paul responded, adjusting the lens dramatically. This deliberate amateur photography was designed to distract and mildly irritate the captain. Soviet border guards were strictly prohibited from being photographed by foreigners, particularly near sensitive installations. The captain, enraged by the tourists' brazen violation of unwritten rules, snapped. "Enough! Put that camera away!" he barked, his focus diverted from the sealed tins to the immediate, irritating offense. He slammed the trunk lid shut, deciding he didn't want the paperwork and hassle that opening diplomatic containers and dealing with these annoying foreigners would entail. The captain then turned his attention to the cabin interior, peering at the thick blankets and pillows on the rear floor, the makeshift cover for the compartment. He bent down, his face inches from the spot where Gordievsky lay. He reached out and pushed the blankets aside with his boot, exposing the exterior of the compartment's cover plate. He did not, however, attempt to lift the heavy plates. "Your vehicle registration is slightly out of date," the captain stated, choosing a minor offense rather than risking the political fallout of a full strip search. He confiscated the car papers and disappeared into the customs office, leaving the MI6 team suspended in a state of controlled panic. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Gordievsky's life. The KGB officer inside the customs hut was clearly making calls, likely to Moscow, to verify the identities and the diplomatic status of the occupants. The Saab sat silently at the barrier line, its engine idling. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, the captain re-emerged, his expression unchanged. He walked back to the Saab, handed the slightly dog-eared papers back to Peter, and snapped, "Drive, and report immediately to the embassy in Moscow upon your return for processing of these documents." Peter nodded crisply, a quiet "thank you, Captain," and slowly, deliberately, eased the car forward. The final barrier, the physical boom, rose slowly. The Saab crossed the no-man's land, a short, desolate 100 yards. Then, they passed the sign, Suomi, Finland. They were out. As the car crossed the Finnish border line, the MI6 team erupted. Peter honked the horn 3 times, a pre-agreed signal of success, and shouted a single word, "Mars." Gordievsky, cramped and numb, heard the cheers and the word Mars, the chocolate bar that had initiated the escape, and understood. He was safe. He had survived the KGB's trap. The moment the car was safely in the Finnish border post, the MI6 team stopped immediately. They tore out the metal tins and insulation. Gordievsky, unable to move his limbs, was gently pulled from the compartment. He was pale, sweating, and almost unable to speak, but his eyes were wide with relief and triumph. He was rushed into the Finnish border office, where a separate MI6 welcoming party, including a doctor and a debriefing team, was waiting. The greatest double agent of the Cold War had reached the West. July 19, 1985. The center, Yasenevo District, Moscow. The news hit the KGB center like a tactical nuclear device. The delayed, internal confirmation that Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Gordievsky had successfully crossed the Finnish border was delivered by a low-level communications officer who watched the movement of the British embassy Saab on the customs log. The sheer audacity of the escape, right under the noses of the border troops, the Second Chief Directorate, and the entire Soviet counterintelligence apparatus, was not just an embarrassment. It was an organizational catastrophe. The initial reaction among the senior leadership was disbelief, quickly morphing into volcanic rage. Viktor Chebrikov, the chairman of the KGB, was reportedly incandescent. He had personally overseen the internal investigation and was now faced with the most catastrophic intelligence failure since the defection of Agent Penkovsky decades earlier. The fact that Gordievsky had been detained, interrogated, and still managed to escape from a carefully managed surveillance environment was an indictment of the entire Soviet security machine. Chebrikov immediately ordered a massive internal purge. Every single officer involved in the Gordievsky surveillance, from the 2 guards at the dacha, Alexei and Sergei, to the captain at the Volhyma border post, was immediately pulled off duty and subjected to a ruthless inquiry by the KGB's own internal security unit. The dacha guards were interrogated for days, accused of complicity and bribery, their careers and freedom utterly destroyed. The captain at the border, despite having meticulously followed procedure, was branded a fool and cashiered. The most acute point of pain for the KGB was the humiliation. A top FCD officer, their resident designate in London, had been exfiltrated by a low-budget, high-concept MI6 operation involving a stinky car and a handful of diplomats. The KGB was famed for its ruthlessness and impenetrable security. The Gordievsky defection ripped a massive hole in that reputation. The damage was twofold: operational and political. Operationally, the KGB scrambled to assess the scope of the intelligence Gordievsky had passed to the West. The reports coming back from London were devastating. Virtually the entire KGB London residency, dozens of officers operating under diplomatic cover, had been exposed. Moscow immediately ordered the complete and total recall of all non-essential personnel from London, effectively crippling their UK operation for years. More critically, Gordievsky's detailed knowledge of Operation Ryan meant the West now understood the full extent of Soviet paranoia regarding a nuclear first strike. The KGB had to assume that every operational procedure, every coded signal, and every clandestine meeting place used during his tenure was compromised. Politically, Gordievsky's defection had a direct and immediate impact on East-West relations. His debriefing, which began within hours of his arrival in Britain, was an intelligence bonanza. He confirmed, in explicit detail, the extent of Soviet espionage in the West, identified countless agents, and, most importantly, provided critical insight into the minds of the aging Soviet Politburo. The Soviets initially tried to manage the political fallout with fury and denial. They maintained that Gordievsky had been kidnapped by the British, a desperate attempt to protect his family in Moscow. The official KGB response was a campaign of defamation, painting Gordievsky as a drunken, corrupt philanderer who had been coerced into defection. This was partly aimed at minimizing the value of his intelligence and partly to control the narrative domestically. The most immediate human consequence was the fate of Gordievsky's family. His wife, Galina, who remained a loyal communist and was entirely unaware of her husband's double life, was plunged into a nightmare. She and their two young daughters, Maria and Anna, were immediately placed under perpetual, severe KGB surveillance. Their apartment was bugged, their mail intercepted, and their movements restricted. Galina was taken in for repeated, aggressive interrogations, during which the KGB attempted to coerce her into denouncing Oleg publicly. They framed the escape not as a defection, but as an abandonment, a psychological operation designed to destroy Gordievsky's morale in the West and prevent her from ever joining him. The KGB's fury extended directly to the British embassy in Moscow. The four MI6 officers who executed Operation Pimlico, Peter, Penny, Paul, and John, were immediately declared persona non grata, PNG, and expelled from the Soviet Union within 48 hours. This was a direct, retaliatory act, stripping the MI6 station of its operational assets. The diplomatic relationship plummeted to a new post-war low. The KGB was not finished. Their primary objective shifted from prevention to retribution. They began a massive, dedicated effort to unmask the internal source that had warned Gordievsky, leading them to the horrifying truth that their own high-ranking agent, Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who had secretly betrayed the U.S., had provided the context of the defector, Vitaly Yurchenko, which led the KGB to Gordievsky. This tragic irony, that a Soviet agent had helped expose Gordievsky, would only fully unravel years later. For the moment, the entire KGB machine was focused on two things: damage control and the grim promise that Oleg Gordievsky would one day pay for his treason. A death sentence was passed in absentia, ensuring that Gordievsky would live the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing the KGB's long reach was now actively seeking to fulfill its promise. July 1985. A safe house, southwest England, UK. Within hours of crossing the Finnish border and a quick transfer flight by the Royal Air Force, RAF, from Helsinki, Oleg Gordievsky found himself in a remote, heavily secured MI6 safe house in the English countryside. The transition was jarring. One moment, the claustrophobic terror of the floorboards, the next, the cool, quiet professionalism of British intelligence. He was immediately placed under the care of a medical team and, more importantly, a select group of MI6 and CIA debriefing officers. The magnitude of the intelligence Gordievsky possessed was staggering. He wasn't just a defector. He was a walking, talking, high-level organogram of the KGB's first chief directorate, FCD. The debriefing was structured and intense, designed to extract the maximum amount of intelligence before the information could degrade or become outdated due to KGB damage control. Gordievsky's first, most crucial contribution was to confirm the names and roles of the vast majority of KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in London, effectively purging the British capital of Soviet espionage. This led to the expulsion of 31 Soviet officials from the UK in September 1985, a mass expulsion that decimated the Soviet intelligence presence and sent a powerful message to Moscow. His revelations on Operation Ryan, the Soviet fear of a surprise nuclear attack, were strategic and world-changing. He provided unprecedented confirmation that the Soviets were not posturing. They were genuinely terrified of a preemptive U.S. strike. This intelligence flowed directly to the highest levels of the U.S. and UK governments, including President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It fundamentally altered Western perception of Soviet intentions, allowing policymakers to adjust military exercises and rhetoric to be less escalatory. Gordievsky's information helped ease the nuclear tension of the early 1980s, arguably saving the world from a potential accidental conflict. For the CIA, Gordievsky was equally invaluable. He identified dozens of KGB agents operating in the U.S. and, critically, confirmed the agency's worst nightmare, that there was a long-term, high-level KGB mole operating within their ranks. While Gordievsky did not know the mole's name, he provided the context and timing of the compromised intelligence, information that would prove essential years later in identifying the traitor Aldrich Ames. Gordievsky laid the groundwork for the most critical counter-espionage investigations in U.S. history. The debriefing process was meticulous. Gordievsky had an almost photographic memory, honed by years of spycraft. He spoke for hours, documenting the internal politics of the center, the names of departments, the budgetary priorities, the personal weaknesses of senior officers, and the KGB's strategic goals for the late 1980s. He revealed the KGB's assessment of Western leaders, their methods of recruitment, and their technological blind spots. To safeguard this priceless asset and prevent any potential assassination attempt, a very real threat given the KGB's immediate fury, Gordievsky was given a new identity and placed under permanent protection. His life in the West began not as a celebrated hero, but as a man constantly looking over his shoulder. However, the shadow of his abandoned family loomed large. Gordievsky's decision to leave without telling his wife, Galina, was an agonizing consequence of his defection. He knew that the Soviet system would use his family as leverage against him, and he was right. From the safety of the UK, he began a relentless, decade-long campaign to secure the release of Galina and his two daughters, who remained hostages of the KGB's retribution in Moscow. He provided the British government with detailed information about his family's loyalty and their innocence in his espionage, hoping to secure a diplomatic intervention. The effort became a major point of tension between the UK and the USSR. The Soviet Union adamantly refused to let them leave, claiming that Galina had chosen to stay and had publicly denounced her husband. A denouncement, of course, extracted under extreme duress. British intelligence, recognizing the immense debt owed to Gordievsky, lobbied intensely. Prime Minister Thatcher raised the issue directly with Soviet officials. The situation was a cruel stalemate. The KGB had lost their biggest asset, but they retained his most vulnerable point, his children. Gordievsky was safe, celebrated in the highest halls of Western power, but he was emotionally crippled by the separation. His new life was one of immense value, but profound personal emptiness. The intelligence he provided shaped the late years of the Cold War. It gave the West an unprecedented advantage, an inside look at the enemy's strategic playbook. Gordievsky's personal sacrifice had paid a monumental dividend, shifting the balance of power decisively in favor of the West. His journey from a disillusioned officer in Copenhagen to the most valuable source of the Cold War was complete, but the most agonizing personal battle, reuniting his family, was just beginning. He had survived the physical dangers of the escape, but the long-term psychological toll of the defection was only now revealing itself. 1986 to 1991. London, UK, and Moscow, USSR. The immediate aftermath of Oleg Gordievsky's exfiltration saw his life split into two distinct, agonizing realities. In London, he was a celebrity in the clandestine world, a primary source for intelligence, and a public face of Soviet treachery. He lived under round-the-clock protection, his new existence a paradox of high value and total isolation. Yet, the celebratory narrative in the West was constantly undermined by the grim reality back in Moscow. His wife, Galina, and their daughters, Maria and Anna, were hostages of the state. The KGB executed a masterstroke of psychological warfare against Gordievsky by relentlessly manipulating his family. Galina, a loyal Soviet citizen who genuinely believed her husband had been kidnapped, was subjected to continuous, soul-crushing interrogation. The KGB painted Oleg as a corrupt traitor who had abandoned them for Western luxuries and betrayed the nation. They showed her Western news reports that depicted Oleg as a high-value spy, contrasting these with the official Soviet line that he was a deserter. Galina's eventual public statements, where she condemned her husband and proclaimed her loyalty to the USSR, were not an expression of free will, but a necessary defense mechanism. Under Soviet law, if she denounced him and cut all ties, the KGB would potentially ease the pressure on her children. She was forced to choose between her marriage and her daughter's well-being. The KGB ensured that these denunciations reached Gordievsky, hoping to inflict maximum emotional damage and disrupt his debriefing. Gordievsky, now under the alias Peter Liddell, used his new platform not for luxury, but for diplomacy. He appealed constantly to MI6, the Foreign Office, and the global media, demanding his family's release under the tenets of international human rights and the Helsinki Accords. He knew the KGB's strategy was to hold them indefinitely, a psychological thumb on the scale against any further cooperation with the West. The political struggle escalated into a diplomatic mini-crisis. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher personally pressed the case during her meetings with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The British position was clear. The release of Gordievsky's family was a humanitarian issue and a necessary step toward improving East-West relations. The Soviets, still smarting from the humiliation of Operation Pimlico, remained obdurate. They insisted that Galina was a private citizen who had chosen to stay. The KGB's paranoia was so intense that they thwarted several complex MI6 planned attempts to exfiltrate the family. These operations involved everything from false identities and border crossings to sophisticated surveillance evasion, but the Soviet security apparatus was now on high alert. The Gordievsky apartment was the most closely watched residence in Moscow. The family was a living trophy of the KGB's vengeance. The stalemate persisted for 4 long years, a period that weighed heavily on Gordievsky's psychological state. He was providing invaluable intelligence, writing books, and consulting on policy, yet his greatest personal mission remained unfulfilled. The emotional toll of knowing his children were growing up without him, isolated and shadowed by the secret police, was immense. A key turning point came with the thawing of the Cold War in the late 1980s and the policy of glasnost, openness. The Soviet Union, facing internal collapse and desperate for improved relations and economic aid from the West, began to see the Gordievsky family as an unnecessary liability rather than a punitive asset. The relentless diplomatic pressure from the British government, aided by quiet American backing, finally began to wear down the hardliners in the KGB and the Politburo. In 1991, on the eve of the Soviet Union's final collapse, a quiet agreement was reached. The terms were never fully disclosed, but it involved a high-level exchange of diplomatic concessions. The KGB, no longer the monolithic power it once was, finally agreed to let Galina and the children leave. The emotional reunion was conducted under intense secrecy. Galina and the children were flown out of Moscow. They arrived in the UK to a life they did not know, a father they hadn't seen in 6 years, and a political reality they barely understood. However, the psychological damage of the KGB's manipulation was irreversible. Galina, having spent years being told her husband was a corrupt traitor and forced to live in fear, found it impossible to reconcile the idealized Soviet husband with the reality of the double-agent spy. The reunion was not a joyous Hollywood ending, but a painful, deeply troubled reconciliation. The stress and lies of the double life, followed by the trauma of isolation, proved too much. While Gordievsky had secured his family's physical freedom, the emotional and psychological separation remained. The marriage ultimately dissolved, a final, heartbreaking casualty of the Cold War. Gordievsky, having faced down the entire KGB apparatus and escaped death, now faced the solitude of a man who had sacrificed everything, including his personal life, for his ideological principles. The legendary escape was over, but the quiet, enduring cost of his moral choice had been paid in full. Washington, D.C. and London, UK. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the immediate threat of KGB retribution against Oleg Gordievsky lessened, but the long shadow of his defection and the secrets he carried were still causing convulsions in the intelligence world. It took nearly a decade for the full, terrifying truth behind his near compromise to emerge, a truth that tied directly back to the very American agency he had helped to protect, the CIA. Gordievsky's debriefing in 1985 had confirmed the existence of a highly placed KGB mole within the U.S. intelligence community. He could not name the traitor, but the precision of his knowledge regarding compromised operations, particularly those involving a secret meeting between CIA personnel and KGB contacts, allowed counterintelligence experts to narrow the field. He had provided the essential starting blocks for a monumental investigation. The mole was finally identified and arrested in 1994. Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA counterintelligence officer. Ames, driven by greed and bitterness, had been selling U.S. and British intelligence secrets to the KGB since 1985. His treachery was staggering, having caused the death or imprisonment of at least 10 major Soviet intelligence assets working for the CIA and MI6. Ames's capture provided the final, chilling pieces of the Operation Pimlico puzzle. Ames had been aware of the defector Vitaly Yurchenko and the fragmented information Yurchenko had provided to the CIA. When the CIA shared Yurchenko's vague warnings, a top-level officer codenamed Farewell in the London residency is a traitor. With MI6, Ames immediately informed his KGB handlers. The KGB already suspected Gordievsky, but Ames's information was the decisive confirmation that prompted Moscow to issue the immediate summons back to the dacha. The revelation hit Gordievsky hard. He realized that the danger in 1985 was even more acute than he had perceived. Not only was the KGB hunting him, but a senior U.S. intelligence officer, the very person who should have been guarding the information, was actively working to deliver him to his executioners. The KGB's decision to bring him back to Moscow, rather than simply ordering his assassination in London, was a direct consequence of Ames's counsel. They wanted to interrogate him and understand the full extent of the damage before executing him quietly in the Lubyanka. Gordievsky's role in exposing Ames, though indirect, was hailed as one of his greatest contributions. His initial testimony years before had ensured the investigation never died, even when the trail went cold. His life, and the success of his escape, was now seen as even more miraculous. He had navigated a triple cross, betrayed by his own agency, nearly caught by the KGB and unknowingly undermined by a traitor in the agency he was trying to save. In the mid-1990s, with his professional value secure and his family, though fractured, safe in the West, Gordievsky settled into a new, quiet life in England. He devoted his time to writing his autobiography, Next Stop Execution, and several books on the history of the KGB. He became a trusted consultant for Western governments and media, offering sober analysis of Russian intelligence activities, which, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, continued under the reformed SVR Foreign Intelligence Service. His life, however, remained marked by the threat of assassination. The death sentence passed in absentia by the Soviet Union was never officially revoked by the post-Soviet Russian state. Gordievsky was a constant reminder of the KGB's greatest failure, and in the opaque world of Russian state security, old grudges never truly expire. The enduring legacy of Operation Pimlico became a case study in intelligence tradecraft, a perfect synergy of agent discipline, strategic warning, and brilliant operational execution. It showcased the best of MI6, the ability to act decisively, improvising where necessary, the stinky car, while adhering to a complex, multi-layered plan. Gordievsky's personal sacrifice was honored by the highest award the British state could bestow on a non-combatant. In 2007, he was appointed a companion of the most distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, CMG, by Queen Elizabeth II for services to the security of the United Kingdom. The award was a public recognition of the monumental, largely unseen contribution he had made to British security during the Cold War. The KGB agent who was supposed to be executed in the Lubyanka's basement was now an honored servant of the crown. The symbolism was profound. His career was a complete reversal of fortunes, a vindication of his youthful crisis of conscience. 2007, present day. The English countryside. The conferment of the CMG in 2007 marked the official peak of Oleg Gordievsky's recognition in the West. He settled into the life of a distinguished exile and security analyst, a role he maintained with unwavering professionalism. Yet, the threat of retribution, though dormant for years, never truly vanished. Gordievsky's survival was, for the Russian state security apparatus, an open wound, and the death sentence passed by the Soviet Supreme Court remained officially unrevoked by the successor state. Gordievsky continued to live under the constant knowledge that he was a prime target. The collapse of the USSR did not mean the disbanding of the intelligence services. The KGB simply rebranded into the FSB, Federal Security Service, and SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service. Many of his former colleagues, including those who had interrogated him, rose to prominence in the new Russian government, ensuring the grudge was institutionalized. This latent threat materialized in a terrifying way in 2007. Gordievsky fell seriously ill, collapsing outside his home. He was rushed to the hospital with acute symptoms of poisoning. British medical and security officials quickly concluded he had been poisoned with a thallium-based substance, a colorless, odorless, and highly toxic heavy metal favored by Russian intelligence for discreet assassination. The poisoning was not immediately lethal, suggesting either a dose calculation error or a deliberate attempt to slowly incapacitate and terrorize. He spent several weeks in a coma and months recovering, suffering permanent nerve damage and significant health complications. The identity of the perpetrators was never officially confirmed in court, but the highly specialized nature of the poison pointed directly toward a state actor with access to sophisticated chemical weapons. This event served as a brutal reminder that the in absentia death sentence was still actively enforced decades after his famous escape. The incident forced MI6 to dramatically upgrade his security, further isolating him from the public life he had begun to enjoy. His analysis of Russian politics, already sought after, became even more authoritative, colored by his own direct experience of Moscow's ruthlessness. He often commented on the nature of the Siloviki, security strongmen, who governed Russia, understanding their mindset from the inside. Despite the danger, Gordievsky never expressed regret for his decision. His conviction, forged in the moral disillusionment of the Prague Spring, remained absolute. He saw his years of service to the KGB as a period of profound error that he had spent the rest of his life correcting. Operation Pimlico was not merely an escape. It was the final physical act of his ideological defection. The legacy of the operation transcends espionage history. It stands as a testament to the moral power of an individual conscience against the machinery of a totalitarian state. The complexity of the planning, the coded Mars bar signal, the two-phase escape from the dacha, the stinky fish countermeasure against the dogs, the sheer audacity of hiding a man beneath the floorboards of a diplomatic car remains unparalleled. It forced MI6 and the CIA to fundamentally reevaluate their handling of Soviet intelligence assets and counterintelligence measures, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Ames exposure. Today, Oleg Gordievsky lives in permanent, quiet seclusion, a man who knows the immense price of freedom. He is a living legend in the history of Cold War espionage, an enduring symbol of a moral conviction so profound it led him to abandon his nation, his career, and his family for the chance to fight for democracy from the enemy's inner sanctum. He remains one of the most decorated and most hunted double agents in history. The car ride beneath the floorboards to the Finnish border was a finite journey of 200 miles, but his journey of exile and vigilance continues, an unceasing, solitary war against a security service that still views him as its #1 traitor. The KGB agents couldn't believe a spy defected right under their noses, and the shame of that failure fuels the enduring threat against his life. The story of Oleg Gordievsky is not just about a daring escape. It's about the conviction that, even in the darkest corners of geopolitical conflict, one person's choice can change the course of history.